Hello students, this is Professor McDermott with another video lecture. The topic today is the period between 1846 and 1861. Sometimes historians call this the Gathering Storm period um, because of the increasing tension, mistrust, polarization between the North and South that was happening during this period leading up to the Civil War, kind of like when storm clouds are gathering and that storm is about to burst loose. So that's what we're going to be talking about today. First, I want to focus on changing attitudes about slavery in the South during the early to mid 19th century. Now, we've talked before about the founding fathers of the U.S. and their attitude to slavery. Men like Washington, Jefferson, Madison were all slaveholders, but they were somewhat apologetic about that. I mean, a little ashamed, actually. They all knew slavery was wrong. Jefferson said in his book Notes on Virginia that he trembled for his country to think that there was a just God. Um, they knew it was wrong, and they did not think it was a good thing. The problem was that they just couldn't think of a way to get out of slavery without causing what they considered to be worse problems. Okay, like massive social unrest, revolution, a lot of suffering even for the freed slaves. They were worried that if you set all the slaves free at once, that they would find it hard to survive with little education, few job skills, and so forth. And so it may seem like an excuse or a rationalization, and actually it was, but the founding fathers knew slavery was wrong. They just couldn't think of a good way to get out of slavery, to put an end to it without causing, as they saw it, worse problems. Jefferson once said slavery was like a little boy who had a wolf by the ears. He was in trouble, whether he held on or let go. Um, However, by the 1830s, Southern leaders like John C. Calhoun, the senator and vice president from South Carolina, were singing a very different tune. Calhoun said in 1837, quote, "Let me not be understood as admitting, even by implication, that the existing relations between the two races in the slaveholding states is an evil. Far otherwise, I hold it to be a good." So Calhoun is saying here that slavery is a good thing, not only for whites, but also for African Americans, hard as that is to believe. This was a very new idea, this idea that slavery was actually a positive good for society. And so we're going to talk about some of the justifications that these Southern leaders had for that opinion, which were widely held throughout the South. It's very interesting. Slaves were very expensive, and only about one quarter, 25% of Southern white people could actually afford to own slaves and did own slaves. So, three-quarters of the population in the South were not, the white population were not slave owners, and yet the slave system had the support of the vast majority of white Southerners, and we've already talked about why that was the case. Why did poor whites support slavery, even though they really didn't seem to benefit from it? Well, when we talked about Bacon's rebellion in Virginia in the 1670s, we talked about how poor whites got that sense of entitlement from the slave system. That sense of racial privilege. It didn't matter how poor you were. You could be poor, illiterate, live in a shack, be barefoot, and so on. But the slave system gave even the poorest of the poor whites a sense of prestige, importance, empowerment, you know. And because, it didn't matter how poor you were as long as you weren't them, the African Americans, right? And so poor white Southerners bought into the system too because of the privileges that it got for them. And That's what the Georgia politician Thomas R. Cobb was getting at when he said in 1858 that one of the good things about the slave system was that, quote, there is no war of classes in the South. Because, he said, every white person, quote, feels that he belongs to an elevated class. It matters not that he is no slaveholder. He is not of the inferior race. He is a freeborn citizen, end quote. And rich white people really knew how to manipulate this sense of white privilege among the poor whites to get the poor whites to defend slavery. And when the Civil War broke out, of course, thousands and thousands of poor whites would rush to volunteer to defend the slave system that really did not benefit them in any material way at all. Another line of argument that pro-slavery people in the South used had to do with the Bible, because practically everybody in the South was a Christian, and they were very familiar with the Bible. And if you ever read the Bible front to back, you'll find many references to slaves and slavery throughout the entire Bible. Well, first of all, there's the story about how the Hebrew people became slaves in Egypt and were led out by Moses to the Promised Land. Now, that was a story that many African Americans looked to for inspiration and hoped that someday they would be free from slavery. But even after that, in the Old Testament, the Hebrews also held slaves. And that's true throughout the Old Testament period. And even in the New Testament, there are slaves. And neither Christ nor his apostles who are writing the New Testament really dispute that. In fact, there's even a letter, it's a letter by St. Paul to Philemon. That's one of the books of the New Testament. It's a very short letter, but what the letter's about is basically he's sending a slave named Onesimus back to his master, Philemon. Now, St. Paul in the letter says that Philemon, the master, should treat Onesimus, the slave, gently and like a Christian brother, because Onesimus has become a Christian. However, it is understood that Onesimus will continue to be a slave, will continue to serve his master. And so when Southern whites read the Bible, to them, it seemed to take slavery for granted. And they turned that into an argument that God somehow approved of the slave system. Now, anti-slavery people often would use the Bible as well. They would point to the words of Jesus where he said things like, the last shall be first, and blessed are the poor, the kingdom of heaven is theirs, and just general ethical principles about how we should treat each other and so forth. But pro-slavery people also were able to use the Bible to argue for their point of view. Now, going along with that, was a growing consciousness in the South as the 19th century went on that if you were a Christian slaveholder, you should treat your slaves with some dignity, or more dignity than had been done in the past. Maybe treat them a little better. This idea was called Christian guardianship. And actually, if you read the letters and diaries of the slaveholders in the South, you'll see that often they refer to their slaves as their children. And they consider all the slaves to be children in their big extended families on the plantation. And increasingly, at least some slaveholders got a conscience about at least trying to treat their slaves a little better. So, for example, we know that slave diet improved as the 19th century went on, and became a little more diverse and a little more nutritious. And partly for that reason, we know that the slave population in the South grew, actually doubled from 2 million in 1830 to 4 million in 1860. And that was entirely by natural increase, by births among the slaves, because, as you know, the African slave trade had stopped in 1808, or at least it was supposed to have stopped completely. So the slaves were reproducing, They were having babies, and the population was growing. Um, Now, however, it must be said that there were limits to this, and if you've watched the movie 12 Years a Slave, for example, you know that um, frequently masters did continue to treat their slaves with cruelty, with harsh punishments, whippings, and other penalties for infractions, real or imagined. And so there were limits to this idea of Christian guardianship, but the Southern planters, though, really bought into it. This paternalistic idea that they were the fathers taking care of their children, and they were shocked when the Civil War broke out. And the first thing that happened was, as soon as the Union Army would get anywhere near their plantations, the slaves would all run away. They couldn't believe it. How dare they? After I treated them so well, my children, and so forth. And actually, believe it or not, they actually believed and bought into this their own propaganda. Um, all right, another argument, which some groups are going to experience from the words of George Fitzhugh. He was a Southern pro-slavery writer, and his line of argument was that if you think slaves had it bad in the South, well, if you look at the lives of Northern factory workers during the Industrial Revolution, they had it even worse. That they didn't have any benefits. They could be fired at the drop of a hat, or if they got sick or injured, and there was no safety net, whereas the slaves at least were guaranteed a place to live and food and at least some primitive medical treatment from birth to death. So Fitzhugh said in the North, quote, "It's every man for himself, and the devil take the hindmost," end quote. Whereas he portrayed the South as, if you will, one big happy family. Now, of course, that was the white pro-slavery view. The slaves would have had a very different perspective on this, and some of the other readings you're going to have for that anti-slavery, for those anti-slavery documents will certainly bring that out. Yet another line of argument which pro-slavery Southerners used to justify slavery had to do with emerging scientific ideas, especially the theory of evolution, which the British scientist Charles Darwin proposed in the 1850s. But even before Darwin, there were some biologists who had suggested that human beings had evolved from lower forms of life. And so this whole question of where human beings came from was reopened. Some of these evolutionary theorists tied their theories into racism by arguing that God had actually created the different races of humanity in separate creations. This idea was called polygenesis, and enabled them to argue that if the races were created at different times and places, that one race might be superior and another race might be inferior. Now, of course, this totally went against the creation account in the Bible, in the book of Genesis, which makes it very clear that, according to that account in the Hebrew Scriptures, God created the first man and woman, Adam and Eve, and all humanity was descended from them. There was no separate creation for Africans or Asians or anyone else. And that Bible account implied that human beings were all part of one family, no matter what their race. And so this idea of polygenesis really kind of went against that whole Christian tradition. Another approach that was taken had to do with an ancient idea that was first proposed by the philosopher Aristotle. Aristotle, the Greek philosopher, believed that some people were naturally meant to be slaves. So if you ended up as a slave, that must mean that it was because you would be best suited to that role. Somehow it was in your I don't want to say DNA because they didn't know about that back then, but it was in your nature to be a slave. Now, it should be said that when Aristotle said those words, that slavery existed throughout the world, but it was not based on race at all. The number one way to become a slave at that time was to be captured in a war, and that could happen to anybody. So Aristotle wasn't saying that one race was inferior to any other race. But for the pro-slavery Southerners, that was exactly the way they saw it, that the white race was naturally fit to be the leaders of society, and that African Americans were somehow created by God to serve white people. And so even the scientific ideas of the time were brought into play to try to support that notion. You see here on the right an illustration. This is from a book called Types of Mankind by Josiah Nott, who was a medical doctor from Alabama, and his co-writer, who was an Englishman, George Glidden. So if you look at this illustration for a second, it's pretty clear what they're saying. At the top of the evolutionary scale is the Caucasian race, the white race, and there at the bottom is the ape or the monkey that we had supposedly evolved from, and you see that their depiction of an African looks much more like the monkey than he does like the white person, who appears to be much more evolved, much more intelligent, and so forth. And so the message here is clear that Africans are not that far removed from monkeys. They are inferior to whites. And so even our scientific theories, we think of them as totally objective, right? But often they aren't, and they can be used and were used to reinforce people's prejudices. All right, well, let's talk about some political developments that had a bearing on the issue of slavery. So I mentioned last time that the Mexican-American War resulted in the United States getting a large amount of territory in the current southwest part of the U.S. from Mexico. Even before the war ended, it was clear that that was going to happen. And so in 1846, a representative from Pennsylvania named David Wilmot proposed a law in the House of Representatives that became known as the Wilmot Proviso. And the Wilmot Proviso was very simple. It just said that slavery would not be permitted in any territory that we got from Mexico as a result of the war. Now, I should say that this bill never passed Congress. It never became a law, but it was the most important political issue of the late 1840s, and increasingly where you stood politically was defined on whether you were for or against the Wilmot Proviso. That is, whether you wanted slavery to expand into those territories or whether you wanted those territories to be free. Now, it should be said that Wilmot, in proposing this, did not do so because he loved African Americans or he really hated slavery. Listen to what he said about his motives for proposing this law. He said, quote, "I have no morbid sympathy for the slave. I plead the cause and the rights of white free men. I would preserve to free white labor a fair country where the sons of toil of my own race and own color, that is white, can live without the disgrace which association with Negro slavery brings upon free labor." End quote. In other words, Wilmot is saying he didn't really care about slaves or African Americans and their rights. He just wanted to keep them out of the territory so that white Americans could move there and find job opportunities. Because, you know, if slavery were allowed in the territories, people would bring in the slaves would do all the work, and there wouldn't really be any opportunities for white workers at that point, you know. So he wanted to keep the territories open as a land of opportunity, if you will, for whites. Furthermore, he says that white workers should be able to live without the disgrace which association with Negro slavery brings upon free labor. What does he mean by that? Well, let's say that, let's say in California, um, if you had large numbers of slaves working in gold mines in California, then what would happen would be that suddenly mining would become defined as slave labor. All right? And when that happened, it would instantly become a disgrace to be a miner, right? And so white people would not want to do it, and the whites who did do it would be stigmatized. They would be looked down upon. And so Wilmot wanted to prevent that by banning slavery entirely from the territories. So you see that even some people who were considered anti-slavery at that time were still quite racist. and their motives for being anti-slavery were not always really pure. In the 1848 election, a new political party formed called the Free Soil Party, which had basically one platform plank, simply, we support the Wilmot Proviso. We don't want slavery to expand anymore into the territories. And the Free Soil Party was basically composed of some members of the old Liberty Party, plus some Whigs and some Democrats who felt strongly on this issue. And they got former President Van Buren to come out of retirement and to run as their candidate with the slogan, "Free soil, free labor, free speech, free men." So again, you see that concern not only with having the territories be exclusively set aside for free white workers, but also the idea that Southerners, pro-slavery Southerners, were trying to restrict free speech ever since the death of Lovejoy. And the Free Soil Party did pretty well for a third party in American politics. Van Buren actually won 10% of the popular vote, showing that more and more people increasingly were willing to say that they thought there should be at least some restrictions on slavery. But the winner of the election of 1848 was a Whig from the Whig Party, Zachary Taylor. He had been a general in the Mexican War. He was also a cotton planter from Mississippi, a slaveholder. And so Southerners believed that Zachary Taylor would be very pro-slavery, and they breathed a sigh of relief when he was elected. However, Taylor really surprised everybody when he said that he thought California should be allowed to enter the Union as a free state. The reason was simply that the vast majority of the people who had flooded into California because of the gold rush really wanted it to be free. And so Taylor said, fine, if that's what they want, this is a free country, they should have it, and California should be admitted as a free state. In fact, California was never a territory because it quickly got such a big population it didn't even have to go through that stage. Well, anyway, when Zachary Taylor said that, it caused a big political controversy because that would give the free states an edge in the Senate, for one thing, 16-15. And so there was a great deal of discussion and controversy about this, and the result finally was the Compromise of 1850, one of the great political compromises in American history. Taylor didn't actually live to see the compromise implemented because one summer day in 1850 he went out to a garden party in Washington and he ate a large amount of cherries and milk. And of course, in those days, milk was not pasteurized, and you could get sick from it sometimes. And so he did. He got gastritis, and then he actually died from that, believe it or not, in 1850, and was replaced by his vice president, Millard Fillmore. But anyway, here are the elements of the Compromise of 1850 as it was worked out. The first element was that Utah and New Mexico, which you see there in blue on the map, were organized as territories of the United States with the understanding that eventually the settlers in those territories would be allowed to vote on whether they wanted slavery there or not. So the people actually on the ground would get to decide whether they wanted to have slavery or not. And this idea was known as the popular sovereignty principle, that the people in those places would decide in New Mexico and Utah. Um, California was admitted as a free state, so now there were 16 free states and 16 free states and 15 slave states. Well, so far you would think that all of this would be on the side of the free states, and the South wouldn't be getting that much out of the Compromise of 1850. So what did they get out of it? It was the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 that Southerners had wanted for a long time. That was what the South got out of the Compromise. Now, in the Constitution, you may recall one of the three provisions relating to slavery was that, yes, fugitive slaves, runaway slaves who went to the north trying to get to Canada, where they could be free, because Canada was part of the British Empire, which had abolished slavery earlier in the century. So at this point in time, if you made it to Canada, you could be free there. Slaves had to be returned to their masters if they were caught in the North. The Constitution even said that. But what the Fugitive Slave Act did was to really put some teeth into that and create a system to enforce that idea. So the Fugitive Slave Act said basically if you were a northerner and you became aware there was a runaway slave hiding in your town, you had to cooperate and help catch that person. And if you didn't, you could actually go to jail. Furthermore, commissioners were hired whose job it was to decide if runaways were actually free blacks or if they were actually slaves. And if they were slaves, it was the commissioner's responsibility to send them back to their masters. So if a slave was if a runaway was captured, they would be hauled up in front of the commissioner, and he would decide their status. But the whole system was rigged because if the commissioner decided that the person was actually a slave, they would get $10. And if they decided that the person was actually a free African American, they would only get $5. So you see, the strong incentive was to just decide that everyone who you pass judgment on was actually a slave. It was a very one-sided system that totally was stacked against African Americans. Now, of course, black leaders in the North, like Frederick Douglass, were shocked and outraged. Douglass wrote that the act, quote, makes it criminal for you to carry out the principles of Christianity, forbids you to follow the example of the Good Samaritan, end quote. You may be familiar with the gospel story of the Good Samaritan, who came across someone on the side of the road who had been beaten and left for dead, and the Good Samaritan helps him, gives him money, binds up his wounds, and takes care of him. So Douglass is saying, look, this law is preventing white northerners or black northerners from helping to take care of these runaways like they should if they were really good Christians. But the Fugitive Slave Act actually made a lot of people angry in the North, not just anti-slavery activists. And I would say the general attitude towards the law in the North was something like this. White Northerners said, look, South, if you want to have slavery down there, okay, it's none of our business, all right? That's your call. But don't come up here to the North and tell me that I'm going to be your slave catcher, because that is not happening. You know, they just didn't want any part of it. And a lot of white Northerners were angry that they were being forced to help capture runaway slaves, and they refused to do it. And in fact, there were even several very dramatic examples where a runaway would be caught and they would be put in jail, you know, kind of awaiting their hearing for the commissioner. And the whole town would show up at the jail and bust them out and actually help that person to get to Canada. These were called fugitive slave rescues, and they happened in several cities and towns in the North, just showing that Northern public opinion was really outraged by the Fugitive Slave Act, and in fact this law really backfired because it helped to turn Northern public opinion against slavery. And stories began to circulate, like you see here in the picture. This is a picture of a very famous episode. In 1855, there was a slave from Kentucky. Her name was Margaret Garner. She had two small children, a boy and a girl. And she ran away across the Ohio River. She made it into Ohio. And she was hiding in a cabin where she and her children were surrounded by the slave catchers who had come to find her and bring her back to slavery. And so Margaret Garner actually cut her own daughter's throat. And when the slave catchers burst into the cabin, she was about to do the same for her son. And the message is very clear here. She would rather have her own children be dead than have them grow up in slavery. The great Nobel Prize-winning novelist Toni Morrison wrote about this incident in her novel, Beloved. Well, anyway, incidents like that really helped Northerners to become more educated and more aware of the plight of runaway slaves. Some Northerners did participate, white and black Northerners participated in what was called the Underground Railroad. I'm sure you're familiar with that. So conductors like the very famous Harriet Tubman would lead runaway slaves through a network of homes where people had shown that they were willing to shelter and harbor these refugees on their way to Canada. And train conductors like Tubman knew how to follow the North Star so that they could go northward and stop at these various stops on the Underground Railroad. So this was something that African American Northerners participated in. Also some white Northerners, especially Quakers, were involved in this. All right, moving on. The Compromise of 1850 did help to settle down the slavery debate for a few years, but then in 1854, Senator Stephen Douglas, very powerful senator from Illinois, upset the apple cart again when he proposed a law called the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854. Now, the motivation for this law, Douglas knew that eventually there was going to be a transcontinental railroad, a railroad going all the way from the Atlantic Ocean to the Pacific Ocean. And he wanted to make sure that the route for that railroad went through his home state, Illinois, specifically through Chicago. And in fact, that's eventually what happened, which is why Chicago became the great city that it is. It was because of the Transcontinental Railroad, which had a northern route. Now, Douglas knew that the best way to make that happen was to encourage settlement of the territories to the west of Illinois, such as Kansas and Nebraska. So he wanted to go ahead and organize those territories and get the maximum number of people to settle there so that the Indians would be driven out, the country would be controlled by Americans, and it would be a peaceful and safe route for the railroad. And so in 1854, Douglas proposed that Kansas and Nebraska be organized as territories on the popular sovereignty principle. In other words, that the people there, once again, like in Utah and New Mexico, would get to decide whether they wanted slavery in their territory or not. They would take a vote. And this law did pass, and it did become the law of the land. Now, the Kansas-Nebraska Act had several very important consequences. The first was that immediately large numbers of both pro and anti-slavery settlers began flooding into Kansas, so that both sides wanted to make sure they could get the most voters into Kansas so that they could win the vote for their side. So both pro and anti-slavery people are flocking into Kansas. Now you can well imagine that these people did not like each other very much, and there began to be incidents of serious violence, murder, mayhem, arson. This was really fueled by armed bands of pro-slavery raiders from western Missouri who would ride into Kansas and attack the anti-slavery settlers, once they even burned the town of Lawrence, Kansas. So essentially what you have in Kansas is a little civil war going on even before the Civil War. It was very violent, very bloody, and so people began calling it Bleeding Kansas. The second result was the total collapse and elimination of the Whig Party from American political life, and that happened because basically all the Southern Whigs were in favor of the Kansas-Nebraska Act, because essentially what the act did was to overturn the Missouri Compromise. The Missouri Compromise had said that all of that land in the Louisiana Purchase north of the southern border of Missouri would be free territory, except for Missouri, right? So essentially this overturned that, and it said now it can be slave territory if the people want it that way. And so all the Southern Whigs were in favor of that, all the Northern Whigs were against it, and so the Whig Party lost its cohesion and it very quickly disappeared. And what eventually emerged from that political confusion was a new political party, the Republicans, that was formed on the principle that slavery should not expand into the territories. And so we have now the third party system. Okay, Whigs and Democrats were the second party system. Now we have the third party system, Republican Party versus Democratic Party, and obviously that is still the party system we are in today. And so the Kansas-Nebraska Act really helped to accelerate the process by which the only important thing in American politics was whether you were from the North or the South, whether you were pro-slavery or anti-slavery. All right, and increasingly politics became polarized between Northerners and Southerners, between anti-slavery and pro-slavery people, and both sides really lost the ability to talk to each other, to dialogue respectfully, to communicate. And that's always dangerous when that happens, and I think you see it to some extent happening in our society today between the supporters of the two major parties, this polarization that makes it very difficult to have civilized political dialogue. And it wasn't really inevitable that that would happen. There were other issues that people were concerned about besides slavery. For example, in the 1856 election, ex-President Millard Fillmore ran as the candidate of a new party called the American Party. This American Party was a nativist party that basically thought only native-born Protestant Americans should be allowed to vote and hold office. They didn't like Catholics. They wanted to restrict immigration from Catholic countries. The American Party was commonly known as the Know-Nothings because they were very secretive, and if you went up to an American Party member and said, "Hey, tell me about your party," if he thought maybe he didn't trust you, he would say, I know nothing. It was sort of a secret society, and so they became known as the Know Nothings. And they actually won quite a few elections, local and state elections, but over time, this issue of anti-Catholicism receded into the background, and the slavery issue took first place in American politics, and it became the organizing factor in American political life. And there's another important incident of the 1850s that really brings that out. We call this the Bleeding Sumner incident. Okay, here's what happened. So there was an anti-slavery senator from Massachusetts named Charles Sumner. Charles Sumner got up one day on the Senate floor, and he pointed to South Carolina Senator Andrew Butler, and he said, "You, Andrew Butler, are married to the whore of slavery." Now, those were fighting words in those days. You said something like that. And Andrew Butler had a nephew who happened to be in the House of Representatives named Preston Brooks, who was angry about what Sumner had said, and he wanted to get revenge on behalf of his uncle, Senator Butler. Now, as you know from the story of Burr and Hamilton, when one gentleman insulted another in those days, the one who was insulted was supposed to challenge the other guy to a duel, right? And they would fight to the death. So you might have expected that Preston Brooks would challenge Charles Sumner to a duel. But Brooks thought it over, and he decided that actually Sumner was not a gentleman, he was just an old drunk. And so he didn't deserve to be challenged to a duel. So Brooks decided to do what a gentleman would do to a lower class person who insulted him. And so late in the afternoon one day, Sumner was working late at his desk on the Senate floor, and Representative Preston Brooks strolled in, and he took his cane and he beat Charles Sumner within an inch of his life, left him there bleeding on the floor. And Sumner really suffered serious injuries. In fact, he was bedridden for several years and wasn't even able to come back to the Senate for quite a long time because of his injuries in this Bleeding Sumner attack. Brooks didn't get prosecuted. Well, actually a prosecution was launched in D.C. He had gone back to his home state, but within a year, Brooks caught an illness and died, which I guess you could say was instant karma. So he was never punished or put in jail for what he did. But the main effect of the Bleeding Sumner incident was just to underline the growing political divide between the North and the South, and the great hostility and tension that was even flaring up into violence. And it made Americans ask the question, who are we? What's happening to our country when a senator can actually get beaten almost to death on the floor of our Senate? What's happening to our society, to political dialogue in our society? All right. Well, we're going to end this part of the lecture with a discussion of a very, very famous case involving an African-American slave named Dred Scott. You see Scott there and his wife and his two daughters there in that newspaper article on the right. Who was Dred Scott, and what was the Dred Scott case? Well, in 1833, Dred Scott was purchased as a slave in St. Louis, Missouri, by a medical doctor named John Emerson. And then Dr. Emerson went to live in Illinois for a while, and then in Wisconsin Territory. Now, from the Northwest Ordinance of 1787 that all of those territories north of the Ohio River were free territories, and slavery, at least theoretically, did not exist there. So anyway, but Emerson took Scott with him when he lived in those places, and then he brought him back to St. Louis. And in 1846, somehow Scott had come into contact with some anti-slavery people, and they convinced him that he should file a lawsuit there in St. Louis, saying that he should have become a free man. The minute he set foot in those free territories, he should have instantly become a free man, and he should have been released from slavery. Now, Scott's lawsuit kind of wound its way around the court system for 11 years and finally reached the U.S. Supreme Court. And in 1857, the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, Roger B. Taney of Maryland, issued the court's decision in the case of Dred Scott versus Sanford. Now, Taney was a slaveholder, and this decision is maybe the most controversial, the most shocking, the most scandalous court decision in Supreme Court history. It was very extreme and very one-sided. First thing Taney said was that this case should have been thrown out of court from the beginning. He said Dred Scott had no standing to sue in a U.S. court because, as a slave, he was not a U.S. citizen. Therefore, the whole case should have been thrown out. And Taney went on to say that blacks, including free blacks, had, quote, no rights which the white man was bound to respect, end quote. Now, that was a very extreme statement. It was one that I think someone like Jefferson or Madison even would have disagreed with. They at least thought the slaves had a right to life. But Taney is now saying that African Americans literally have no rights, no natural rights, no civil rights at all. Then Taney said that the Missouri Compromise of 1820 had always been unconstitutional, that Congress had never had any power to stop slavery from spreading anywhere it wanted to go, including the territories. And so Taney said that all of the territories should be immediately opened up to slavery. Now, the Dred Scott decision was so radical that it really was never implemented in its totality. You know, if it had been, it would have caused the Civil War probably to happen sooner. And so some of the territories were still closed to slavery in spite of the Dred Scott decision. But what the Dred Scott decision did was to really send up alarm bells all across the North that politicians like Lincoln could exploit, because it opened up the idea that maybe slavery could even go back into the North, which was something that the Northerners, even most white Northerners, really did not want to happen. And so the Dred Scott decision became another moment in the increasing polarization and mistrust and paranoia that was taking place between the North and South. By the way, I want to mention that so Scott, as a result of the decision, was sent back into slavery, but a couple of years later, a well-wisher purchased him and set him and his family free. So actually, Scott did die as a free man. Well, this isn't all, because the storm clouds are still gathering, and the storm is about to break loose. But in order to find out how that occurred, you're going to have to watch a second part of this lecture, which is called The Rest of the Gathering Storm. So when you're ready, please continue with that.